what is on your plate. There are children in this world with nothing. A grandmother in rural Tennessee said those words at a kitchen table more times than anyone could count. And every child who heard them understood without being told twice that something was being asked of them, not just to clean a plate, to carry themselves a certain way, to know that the small things they did at that table were the first lessons in a much longer education, one that had nothing to do with books and everything to do with the kind of person they would become. There was a time when an American child knew a dozen rules before they ever knew their letters. They knew to stand when an older person entered the room. They knew not to speak until spoken to at the supper table. They knew that a screen door was not to be slammed, that a hat came off indoors, that yes ma'am and no sir were not optional. These were not taught in any classroom. They were taught in the kitchen, on the front porch, in the back seat of the car, on the way to church. They were taught by mothers and grandmothers and fathers who believed that a child who could not say thank you properly was a child who had not yet been finished. This is the story of 20 manners that nearly every American child learned before the first grade. 20 small rules that turned children into something the world used to call well-raised. And it is the story of how, somewhere along the way, the schools stopped teaching them, the homes stopped requiring them, and a whole generation grew up without ever being shown. This channel exists for one reason: to remember how American families lived, raised their children, kept their homes, and held one another together before so much of it slipped away. If you believe these old ways are worth preserving, take a moment to subscribe. It costs nothing, but it tells this channel that someone out there still cares whether these stories get told at all. And that is no small thing in a world that forgets so quickly. Number 20. Looking a person in the eye when you spoke to them. A child in Missouri, no taller than the kitchen counter, was taught that when an adult addressed them, the proper thing to do was to lift their face, meet the grown person's eyes, and answer clearly, not to mumble at the floor, not to hide behind a mother's skirt, to look up and be seen. A grandmother would take a child gently by the chin and say, "Look at me when I am speaking to you." And the child learned that to face another person directly was a form of respect, a way of saying, "I am here, I am listening. You matter enough for me to look at you." It seems a small thing. It was not. A child who learned to hold another person's gaze grew into an adult who could shake a hand and mean it, who could sit across a table from a hard conversation and not look away. That habit, planted before the age of 6, lasted a lifetime. The schools today do not teach it. What passes for childhood now lets a boy stare into a glowing rectangle through an entire meal and never once meet the eyes of the people who love him. Number 19. Saying please before the asking and thank you after the receiving. Before a child could read, they knew that nothing came to them without a please attached to it. Not a glass of milk, not a cookie from the discount rack, not a turn on the swing. And the moment the thing arrived, a thank you was expected, prompt and sincere. A mother in the Carolinas would simply hold the cookie just out of reach and wait, saying nothing until the small voice remembered the word. She did not lecture, she waited. And the child learned that gratitude was the price of receiving, and that the price was always worth paying. These 2 words were the cornerstone of the whole structure. A child who had them could be trusted in any house in the county. A child who had them would be welcome at any table. They were the first proof that a person had been raised, and everyone who met that child could tell, in the space of a single sentence, whether the words were there or not. Number 18. Standing when an older person entered the room. In a front room in West Virginia, when a grandmother or an elderly neighbor came through the door, the children rose to their feet. Without being told, it was automatic, drilled in so early that no child remembered learning it. The standing said something words could not. It said, "You are owed something simply for having lived longer than us." It said, "Your years count for something in this house." A boy would give up his chair to a widow at a church supper and think nothing of it, because giving up the chair was simply what a person did. There was an order to things, and the order honored age over youth, and the young accepted it because they understood that one day they too would be old, and that the same chair would be offered to them. That was the quiet promise inside the manners. You honor the old now, and you will be honored when you are old. Number 17. Removing a hat indoors. A working father in Pittsburgh, coming home from the mill, would take his cap off the instant he crossed the threshold of his own kitchen. And his sons watched him do it every single day, and so they did it too. A hat came off at the table. A hat came off in church, naturally. A hat came off when a man stepped into another man's home, and especially when he greeted a woman. It was a small motion of the hand, but it carried the weight of an entire idea that certain places and certain people deserved a man to bare his head and stand a little plainer before them. Number 16. Not interrupting when grown people were talking. A child learned to wait when adults were speaking. A child did not push into the conversation with whatever bright thing had just crossed their mind. They stood at the edge, patient, until there was a pause, and then they spoke. If something was truly urgent, they had been taught to place a hand quietly on a mother's arm and wait to be acknowledged rather than to cut across her words. The waiting taught patience. The waiting taught that a child's every passing thought was not the most important thing in the room. The waiting taught humility before it had a name. Number 15. Answering when spoken to and answering properly. A grandmother in the Ozarks asked a child a question and expected a real answer, not a shrug, not a grunt, not a one-word mumble. Yes, ma'am, no, ma'am. I do not know, ma'am, but I will find out. A child who shrugged was sent to think about it. A child learned that a question deserved the dignity of a full reply, and that to answer a person clearly was to treat them as someone who mattered. Number 14. Sitting up straight at the table. The elbows came off the table. The back straightened, the napkin went into the lap. A mother did not need to say it twice after the early years, because the body had learned it. To slump over a plate was to disrespect the food, the cook, and the company. To sit up was to say, this meal is an occasion, however plain it is, and I will treat it as one. Number 13. Asking to be excused before leaving the table. No child rose from the family table until they had asked and been permitted. May I be excused? For words. The meal was a thing the family did together from the first bite to the last, and a child did not simply abandon it the moment their own hunger was satisfied. They asked because the table belonged to all of them, and to leave it was to ask leave of the whole. The food industry does not want a person to think too hard about that table. The table was where a family was assembled, counted, held together for the length of a meal. It cost almost nothing. A pot of beans, a pan of cornbread, a pitcher of cold water. And around it, children were quietly taught everything they would ever need to know about belonging to other people. There is no profit in a family that sits down together over $1 worth of food and needs nothing else for an hour. The meals that fed your grandparents and raised them right are the meals nobody can sell you now. And so the table grew quiet, and then it grew empty, and a generation learned to eat standing up, alone, looking at a screen, and called it freedom. Number 12. Greeting a guest at the door. When company came, the children went to the door. They said hello. They took a coat, if a coat was offered. They asked if the guest would like to sit, would like a glass of water, would like anything at all. A child in Nebraska learned to be a small host in their own home, to understand that a guest under the roof was a kind of sacred thing, owed warmth and attention from the youngest member of the household on up. Number 11. Writing a thank you note for a gift. Before a child could write much of anything, a mother would guide a small hand across a card, spelling out the words of thanks to an aunt who had sent $1, a grandmother who had knitted a sweater. The note went in the mail. The giver knew their gift had landed in grateful hands. A child learned that a kindness received created a small debt of acknowledgement, and that the debt was paid in ink in one's own hand and not left unpaid. If you grew up with any of this, leave a comment and tell where you are from. This channel reads every one of them. There is something quiet and good about seeing how widespread these old ways once were. How a child in Alabama and a child in Wisconsin were being taught the very same things at the very same kitchen tables by mothers who never met and never would. Say where your people were from. Say what your grandmother required of you. These memories are scattered now, and the comments are one of the few places left where they can be gathered back together. Number 10. Covering the mouth when coughing or sneezing. A small hand went up to a small mouth. It was taught for the sake of others, which was the whole point of it. A child learned early that their body, and its sounds and its spray, were not to be inflicted on the people around them, that to live among others was to take constant small care not to be a burden to them. Manners, at bottom, were always this: 1,000 tiny ways of considering the comfort of someone other than yourself. Number 9. Saying, excuse me, when a child needed to pass through a room of grown people, when they bumped someone, when their own body made a sound it should not have. The words came out, excuse me? The phrase acknowledged that one had, however slightly, intruded on the world of another and asked a small pardon for it. A child who said "excuse me" 100 times a day was a child being trained, breath by breath, in the art of moving gently through the lives of others. Number 8. Shaking hands when introduced. A father in rural Alabama would crouch down to his son's level and show him, "This is how you shake a man's hand. Firm, not limp, not crushing. Look him in the eye. Say your name." A boy of 5 could already give a handshake that a grown man would respect, and that handshake would open doors for him for the rest of his life. It was the first contract a child ever signed, the first time they presented themselves to the world as a person to be reckoned with. Number 7. Offering the last of something to a guest before taking it yourself. There were 3 biscuits left, and 4 people, and a child learned to offer first and take last. To watch the plate and make sure the guest, the elder, the smaller child, was served before reaching for their own portion. In a house where there was never quite enough, this was the hardest manner of all, and the most important. A child who could pass the last biscuit to someone else had learned the thing that no school can teach, that another person's need could matter more than your own want. These were not just rules of etiquette. They were the small, daily proofs that a child belonged to something larger than themselves, that they were one thread in a fabric of people who looked after one another. Every please, every offered chair, every last biscuit passed across the table was a child practicing, in miniature, the whole work of being a decent human being among other human beings. We have taught a generation to look after itself first, to know its own rights and its own feelings and its own wants better than any generation before it. And we have wondered why so many of them feel so alone. A child who was raised to think first of others was a child who was woven early and deep into the lives around them. That weaving was the gift, and it is the thing we forgot to keep giving. Number 6. Addressing adults as sir and ma'am or Mr. and Mrs. No child called a grown person by a first name. Never. It was Mr. Hadley, and Mrs. Pruitt, and aunt and uncle, and ma'am and sir. The titles built a fence of respect around the older generation, a fence the child was glad to honor because it told them clearly where they stood. A world without those titles is a world where a 6-year-old believes they are the equal of a 60-year-old, and a child who believes that has been robbed of something, though they will never know its name. Number 5. Keeping your voice down indoors. A child learned that the house was a shared space, that a mother resting, a father reading the paper, a baby sleeping in the next room, all had a claim on the quiet. Hollering was for the yard. Indoors, a child kept their voice low and their feet soft. It taught them that they were not the only person in the world, that the peace of a home was a thing built and kept by everyone in it, including the smallest. Number 4. Waiting for everyone to be served before eating. The hands stayed in the lap. The fork stayed down. No matter how the smell of the supper pulled at a hungry child, they waited until the last plate was filled and the blessing was said. And then, together, the family began. To eat before the others was the mark of a person who thought only of their own hunger. To wait was to say, "We eat as one, this family, at this table, and no one here is more deserving of the first bite than anyone else." Number 3. Helping to clear the table without being asked. A child watched the meal end and rose to gather plates, scrape them, carry them to the sink. Not because they were told. The telling came only in the early years, but because they had come to understand that the work of the home belonged to all of them. A mother who cooked did not also have to clear. The hands that ate were the hands that cleaned. A child raised this way grew into an adult who saw what needed doing and did it, without waiting to be asked, without keeping score. Now we come to the 2 that matter most, the 2 that everything else was built toward. Number 2. Looking after the younger ones. An older child was made responsible for a younger one. The 8-year-old watched a 4-year-old, held their hand crossing the road, made sure they ate, stood between them and harm. A child in a coal camp in West Virginia might be raising their baby sister half the day while their mother worked, and that child learned before they could read that another person's safety could be placed in their hands and that they were equal to the weight of it. There is no greater lesson a person can learn. To be needed by someone smaller and weaker and to rise to it is the beginning of every good thing a human being can be. A grandmother who knew how to stretch a pot of soup across 3 days and feed every mouth at her table was never afraid of an empty cupboard, because she had her people, and her people had her, and between them they would always find a way. We have given her grandchildren full cupboards and a quiet, gnawing fear that no amount of fullness can touch. The fear of needing someone, the fear of being needed. We taught the children to be independent, and we did it so well that many of them no longer know how to lean on anyone or to be leaned upon. The old manners were never really about forks and hats. They were about this. They were about teaching a child 1,000 small ways at a time that they belonged to other people and other people belonged to them. Number 1, showing kindness to those who had less. This was the foundation under all the rest. A child was taught to share their lunch with the boy who had none, to be gentle with the old man down the road who talked to himself, to never ever laugh at someone's worn-out shoes or patched coat or empty pail. A mother in the Carolinas would tell a child, "You do not know what that family is carrying, and you will not add 1 ounce to it." The whole vast structure of manners, every please and thank you and yes ma'am, came down at last to this single thing. The care of one human being for another, and especially the care of those with more for those with less. That was the heart of it. A child who learned the other 19 manners and missed this one had learned nothing. A child who learned only this one had learned everything. Because in the end, every rule at that table, every habit drilled in before the 1st grade was pointing at the same truth. That a person is measured not by what they have, but by how they treat the people around them, and most of all, the people who have nothing. Here is the quiet thing that ties all 20 together, the thing your grandmother knew in her bones and never had the words for. What made those families strong was not that they had much, most of them had almost nothing. What made them strong was that they had each other, and they knew it. And every manner a child learned was one more thread tying them tighter to the people they would spend their lives needing and being needed by. The empty chair offered to the widow, the last biscuit passed across the table, the baby sister held by the hand. These were not rules. They were the daily practice of belonging to one another. So here is one small thing to try this week. Just one. Find a child in your life, a son, a grandson, a niece, a neighbor's boy, and teach them one of these. Teach them to look you in the eye and shake your hand. Teach them to say thank you and mean it. Teach them to offer the last of something before taking it for themselves. It will take you 5 minutes. It will outlast you by 70 years. The schools have stopped and the books have moved on, but a thing taught hand to hand by someone who loves the child was always how these manners traveled anyway. They never came from a classroom. They came from a kitchen, from a porch, from a father crouched down to a small boy's height. They can still come from you. If you found something here worth keeping, subscribe so the next of these stories finds its way to you. Share this with someone who was raised this way, or who wishes they had been, a sister, a mother, the friend from church whose children still say, "Ma'am." And in the comments, leave the one manner your grandmother required of you that you almost never see in a child today. Write it down. That is how these things survive. Now, not in any school, but in a long list of remembered voices, one added to the next. That is how they raised us. That is what we let slip away. And that is what any one of us can still hand to a child this very week with nothing more than a little time and the will to do it